Hello, friends. I have another game to share with you all. A game that I played against another streamer. His name's Omid Malik on Twitch, and he's a national master, as you can see. Very strong opponent from Canada. He actually reached out to me to do a match with him, and this is one of our games. One of the games that I actually ended up winning, which was pretty good for me, and it's a very exciting game. Uh, this is actually a comeback win. So he was actually beating me very early on out of the opening, and I ended up getting some counterplay. So let's check out this game. He starts with d4, and I play knight f6, and he brings out the bishop immediately, putting pressure on the knight. I continue with e6, so now my knight's pinned, and he takes advantage of this immediately with e4, the threat of e5. Now, I can get out of that with h6 and g5, but I don't want to ruin my kingside pawn structure. So I develop the bishop, breaking the pin. He insists on attacking the knight, so I play knight to d5. We trade bishops, and now I take back with the knight instead of the queen. And now my knight has gone from f6 to e7. So kind of underdeveloping the knight a little bit, not on an optimal square that it was on f6. And it's also kind of blocking my queen a little bit. So this is going to be important. He continues developing the knight. I castle, and he brings out the bishop, already pointing at h7. So I really quickly did not address this at all, and I played d6, trying to fight back in the center. And already Omid can take on h7 with a Greek gift sacrifice that I missed. And it's all because the knight not on f6 is not defending h7, and it's blocking my queen's view of g5, where the knight would like to go. So he takes, and I do not dare accept this gift because after I do, knight g5 hits hard with the queen h5 to follow, trying to get to h7 with checkmate. So I would have to bring the king up to g6, and that's not really a line that I want to play. So I decline the gift. I go to h8. He brings the king back, not the king, the bishop, and he's preparing to move the knight to bring the queen in. So I take the pawn. He takes with the knight. And already this is a big threat, a mate in 2 threat to be precise. So I have to block this somehow. So I decide to block the bishop. I play f5. He goes back, and I develop my knight. And again, this is probably a mistake because very simply, white can just trade down here and say, hey, I'm up a pawn. Your king isn't very safe, and your pawns are really bad. So Omid here, very solid structure. Very good position here moving forward. He could simply just go to castling right now and be beginning into the middle game with a really happy pawn structure and laughing at my pawn structure. But instead of castling, he develops his knight, and this allows me to play bishop to a6, saying no more kingside castling for you. So his king can no longer castle. He's going to have to go queenside, and he does so by delivering queen check, developing move with tempo, and preparing long side castles, which he does now, defending this pawn from my queen, and just getting the king out of the middle of the board. But because of this, I can now use this open b file to really put some pressure on his queen side, where his king resides. So right now there's no threats, but he continues with g4. So g4 is kind of an interesting move. He's saying that, well, I've got this open h file, and hopefully I'll open up the g file, and I'm really going to checkmate this vulnerable king. However, g4 comes with some setbacks. These squares are all now a little weaker because of this g-pawn move. So I try to take advantage of that immediately with a centralization of the queen on the dark squares, looking at potential ideas both on the b file and on this diagonal with a check. And Omid sees this. He decides to prevent queen b4, doesn't want to deal with any mating ideas on b2. or doesn't want to get the pawn on the b file pinned, which will weaken these squares around his queen side. So he plays the move a3. And already I can kind of feel things turning in my favor. Not quite yet, but this rook is very powerful. And even though it looks like my king side is not as safe as his, my pieces are going to be more coordinated in an attack on his king. So I come in with queen f4 check. Now, if he tries to move towards the b file, I can play queen f3, which is attacking this knight. And if he moves the knight, then I can take a3. So if he tries to defend the knight with a rook move, well, his other rook's going to be hanging. So there's a lot of counterplay to be had here if the king moves over. So instead, he plays the only other move, rook to d2. Now, this also comes with its own setbacks. I have a really strong punch here. Rook takes b2, saying this king is overloaded, defending both the pawn and the rook. He can't do both. So if he takes my rook now, queen takes on d2. Very powerful move, and rook b8 is not far off, separating the king from the defense of the knight. It's not looking good for the white king over here. So instead, he doesn't have to take, and it seems like there's no follow-up threats with this move. So Omid plays g5, continuing with his plan of checkmating my king with the pawn getting the g6. However, Omid doesn't have time to play g6 because I have a really strong move here, like a knockout blow. And it's actually kind of hard to see. It took me a while to find this move. So I did not have this move planned after rook takes b2. But I'll let you guys pause the video if you want. Try to find it yourself. This is a very instructive moment, I believe. And this move on its own is really why I wanted to share this game with you, because it's such a beautiful move. So if you haven't already paused the video, feel free to do so. But I'm going to move on. The move is bishop to d3. Very strong move. Very beautiful move as well. It looks like it can be captured by two pieces, but first off, the rook is pinned. So the rook will not be capturing this bishop. But secondly, this pawn is also pinned because this pawn is the only thing preventing my queen from taking on d2. So this rook is pinning the pawn this way. And so neither piece can grab this bishop. This bishop is immune on d3. So yeah, really cool move. And it's not just some fancy move where, hey, I can put a piece here and you can't do anything about it. It comes with a very concrete threat. Rook takes c2. Because again, this rook is pinned. Not only can it not capture d3, but it can't defend c2. So rook takes, and this rook will be falling. And so will the king. So the best move here is actually queen to d1 to give up the queen on c2 after rook takes, and then bishop takes, king takes, and black will be very happy in this position. So Omid, understandably not wanting to give up the queen just yet, plays rook or king takes b2, taking the rook. But this allows for queen takes on d2, the original plan. And again, this pawn is pinned no longer from the rook on the b file, but from the queen now on the d file. So the threat is to take this pawn and then take this knight with check. And so he really has to defend, but there's no way to defend the c pawn and rook b8. So only now does Omid bring the queen back to d1, but it is too little too late. Rook b8 hits hard, and the knight is going to fall. Best move here is to play bishop check, forcing the king into the corner, and then queen takes knight with check and mate. Unfortunately, I didn't do that. Didn't really matter, though, as I take the knight, and the threat of mate is unstoppable. There's too many mate threats, too few defenses. So Omid decides to take on d3 finally, but that leads to queen b2 mate. So the best move probably would have been to give up the queen, but yeah, the game is just over at this point. So awesome game here. Definitely was losing out of the gate, but getting the bishop to a6, forcing him to castle onto the open b file, and getting this counterplay with the queen, and ultimately the knockout blow, bishop d3, never allowing the time to play g6, queen h7. So yeah, hopefully you guys learned something from this. This was a really fun game to play. Omid ended up beating me 7 times in a row after this game, so not just the only game that we played. So Omid's definitely a much better player than me, but I did manage to get this one really good checkmate on him. And it's all thanks to this bishop move. So hopefully you guys learned something. And yeah, I'll see you next time.